This is the Regular Pastor Podcast, the only podcast devoted to regular pastors and regular churches. My name is Landon Coleman. I'm the regular pastor here at Emmanuel Baptist Church in Odessa, Texas. You have somehow drifted into the fifth season of the Regular Pastor Podcast. If you've been with me from the beginning, thank you. If you're just jumping in, welcome. Here in Season 5, we are talking about books. We're talking about ideas that are found in books, and we're trying to apply the ideas that are found in books to the day-to-day ministry of regular pastors. The book that I'm going to talk about today is titled Pastoring Small Towns, and it's written by two men, Ronnie Martin and Donnie Griggs. This is a B&H Broadman and Holman publishing book, published in 2023, so it's just about a year old. The book is hardback. It's 175 pages, and it's printed in a small format. So when I say 175 pages, this is really a short book. It's a quick book. There's a foreword and an introduction at the beginning, and then there's 10 chapters that make up the heart of this book. Half of them are written by Ronnie Martin, and half of them are written by Donnie Griggs. And one of the things I like about this book is that they tell you who wrote which chapter. Sometimes when you read a book and you have co-authors, you're left wondering who wrote this chapter, who's talking here. But these guys tell you, was it Martin or was it Griggs? Just a little bit about these two guys, some author biography for you. Both of these men pastor churches in what most people would consider small towns. Donnie Griggs was raised in Morehead City, North Carolina. The population of that town is about 10,000, and in that town he planted One Harbor Church. Ronnie Martin used to be a musician, a recording artist, and he planted a church called Substance Church in Ashland, Ohio, about twice the size of where Griggs is at in Morehead City, North Carolina, but still Ashland, Ohio comes in around 20,000, so definitely in the small town category. Both of these men, Martin and Griggs, write for the Gospel Coalition, and both of them have ministries outside of their local church responsibility, and those ministries are intended to encourage local church pastors. If I had to give you the big idea of this book, I would turn to page 5. And on page 5, this is in the introduction, the authors state clearly for us, our aim is to take a closer look at what it's like to be a pastor in a small town, to acknowledge the challenges, and to provide some not so brilliant encouragement to those who are doing what we do. So they have a few things tied up in that purpose statement. They want to take a closer look, number one, at what it's like to be a pastor in a small town. Number two, they want to acknowledge or recognize some of the challenges. And then number three, they want to encourage other men who are pastoring in a small town setting. They acknowledge in the foreword of this book that when you lead a church in a small town, you are going to have to look for your identity and your validation in Christ and not in your platform and not in your visibility. Martin and Griggs are right. When you pastor in a small town, people care more about your pastoral bedside manner than the letters that come after your name and your degrees that hang on the wall. Martin and Griggs are right. When you pastor in a small town, you actually have to live with the people that you pastor. It's not true in the same way when you live in a sprawling metropolis, a massive metro area. But when you live in a small town and you pastor in a small town, you go to the same grocery store with your people, you send your kids to the same schools, you participate in the same civic organizations and functions. There are unique challenges that come with pastoring in a small town. And in this book, I think Martin and Griggs do a good job of providing encouragement. They know what they're talking about. They've lived what they're writing about, and they do offer encouragement. So they're looking at what it's like to pastor in a small town. They're acknowledging the challenges, and they're offering encouragement. If I tried to give you a few important ideas from this book, I would probably end up giving you, let's give 4. One is this. The book is titled Pastoring Small Towns. It is not titled Pastoring in Small Towns. And that's an important thing to note right out of the gate. These guys are not talking only about what it's like to be in a small town, but what it is like to pastor that town. And if you pastor in a church, in a community that is less than 10, 15,000, you are the pastor of that town. The people in that community look to you as a pastor, not just of your church, but of the community itself. I live in a community that is about 120,000 people, 130,000 people, and it's even true in my context in Odessa, Texas, to some degree. Odessa is not a sprawling metropolis, and there certainly is a sense in which people expect pastors to pastor the town itself. But the smaller you get, Griggs and Martin are right. You're not just pastoring in a small town, you're pastoring that small town. Another important idea is on page 16. This is one of the most helpful things that they talk about in the book. They acknowledge that when you pastor a small town, you have to be part of the town. You have to be a member of the community. It's true that you live in a fishbowl. Everyone can see you and knows your business. It's hard to get away. You can't run to the grocery store without bumping into church members or neighbors. It's true that you get what feels like less time off or less time away from ministry responsibilities. That's just the nature. They acknowledge, Martin and Griggs acknowledge rightly, it's just the nature of pastoring a small town. And they talk about Jesus calling Peter and the apostles, and Jesus saying, you need to care for the sheep and you need to care for the flock, and you're going to be with these people and you're going to live with these people, and you've got to be part of their lives. That is true in a unique and an intensified way when you pastor a small town. Another helpful idea is towards the middle of the book, about page 45 and 46. Griggs and Martin talk about patience. Patience is essential when you're pastoring in a small town, when you're pastoring a small town. And patience is hard for pastors in small towns because churches in small towns, more often than not, really need to make changes, a number of changes, a number of issues, a number of things that need to be updated. Change is needed in most small town churches, but you have to be patient. And as they talk about the importance of patience in the context of a small town, they do a good job of saying you have to treat your people like people, not like projects. You can't view your job as a pastor as a project manager where you're driving change as quickly as possible. But you're a shepherd, and you've got to shepherd and care for the flock. You've got to take care of the sheep, and that means you can't drive change too quickly or too fastly. One last idea that I think is helpful, really, really helpful for anyone who pastors in a small town or a smaller community, is some advice they give in the book about social media. They encourage pastors who are serving in a small town to use their social media presence to proclaim the truth. Use your social media presence to express gratefulness. Use your social media presence and your connections to share resources like books or podcasts or articles. Use your social media presence to distribute information, Maybe you can even find ways to develop community, but one of the things you have to watch about when you pastor a small town is grumbling on social media and complaining on social media and shaming businesses or organizations or people on social media. And the reason you have to be careful about this in a small community is that everyone's connected. If you post something about a local business, someone in your community owns that business, and they're going to see your post. And the super connected nature of small towns, especially with social media, just means that you can't be a grumbler or a complainer when you get on Facebook or Instagram or X. One of the things I really love about this book and I appreciate, I've seen this be an issue with fellow pastors here in Odessa who are pastoring a relatively small community, is the issue of qualified leaders. I don't think any pastor feels like they have too many qualified leaders, but I can certainly point to some urban settings or some seminary-type churches where a congregation may have an overabundance of qualified leaders. Most churches don't have that, and most churches in small towns certainly don't have that. And my experience is that young pastors, new pastors coming into churches in small towns, they do a lot of complaining about their lack of qualified leaders. And I just like this quote from Griggs and Martin. This is page 123. Instead of complaining about not having more, and by more they're talking about more qualified leaders, instead of complaining, let's consider how to leverage what he has given us until he returns. Two things faithful churches do to multiply is make disciples and appoint qualified leaders. And so these guys are just saying, look, you're going to go to a small town. You're not going to have an overabundance of qualified leaders unless you do something about it, unless you set out to do the hard work of discipleship and leadership training and pushing people into leadership opportunities and encouraging people to step out and to lead. You can sit around and complain about the leaders you don't have, or you can just get busy discipling and raising up new leaders for your church. So I think this is a helpful quote and a super helpful idea. When I think about this book and I think about ministry takeaway, I am most broadly part of an evangelical tribe of Christians and a little more narrowly part of the Southern Baptist Convention. And I think it's generally true that Southern Baptists and evangelicals are largely obsessed with big and bombastic and popular and spectacular. And none of those things are usually true when you pastor in a small town. You don't get the most retweets. You don't get invited to conferences. You don't get the book contracts. But in a small town, you do get to be the pastor of that town. And the people in that town, whether they attend your church on a Sunday or not, they will look to you in times of crisis. And you will have opportunities to shepherd people and to share with people that you would otherwise not have in larger metropolitan areas. And so I think the ministry takeaway to those who pastor in small towns is be faithful and be ready as long as the Lord leaves you in a small town or a small community. If I had to give any critique or criticism to this book, it would just be gentle and friendly, but I think there's, for a short book, too much about the pandemic and too much about the election with Trump. I think those issues will date this book, and even already as I read it in 2024, I looked back and thought, you didn't need to have that stuff in there. You could have found other examples or illustrations to use. I do think, having lived in small towns, a couple of places and pastored in small towns, I think the guys are, at least from my experience, maybe a little bit hard on small town folks when it comes to issues of race and bigotry, and in particular when it comes to how family-oriented people tend to be in a small town or a small community, how closed off they tend to be to outsiders, how resistant they tend to be to change. I just don't think that these are the problems, at least the common problems or the prevalent problems that I have faced in small communities. And I actually think that some of these dynamics that they talk about are strengths of small towns and churches in small towns and small communities, not problems that pastors are going to have to overcome. And so I would disagree with them on some of their critique and some of the maybe pot shots they take at small town folks and the way life happens in a small town. If you get on Goodreads, you will find that this book comes in with a 4.18 rating. I think that's probably fair. I gave it a 4-star rating out of 5 on Goodreads. Who should read this book? Look, if you're a regular pastor, that's what this podcast and my blog is all about. If you're a regular pastor and you feel stuck in a small town, you should read this book. If you're a regular pastor and you're just starting out in ministry and you feel like the only job you were able to get was at a small church in a small town, I think this book would be helpful for you. I think there's ideas here, realities, encouragement that would be helpful for you. It's a real book. It's an honest book, and it's written by guys who have done and are doing what they're writing about here. This is not a mega church pastor telling you how to pastor a small town church or how to pastor a small town. But these are guys who are actually doing it, and I think there is some wisdom here that can be an encouragement to regular pastors. Thanks for listening to the Regular Pastor Podcast. Be sure to subscribe for weekly episodes here in Season 5. You can follow me, Regular Pastor, online at regularpastor.com. You can find me on Goodreads. Send me a follow or a friend request by searching for Landon Coleman. If you have a book recommendation, something you'd like me to read and review here on the podcast, let me know. Landon at EmmanuelOdessa.com. Until next week, this is the Regular Pastor, pastoring in a small town.